Get ready to uncover groundbreaking ideas, discover the hidden challenges, and explore the untapped potential of marketing in the digital age. This is Fair Play with Arun Kumar, the podcast that takes you on a journey into the impact of data and technology in marketing. Here's Arun.
Welcome to Fair Play. I'm back with Dr. Lee Schlenker. Lee likes to say he isn't a marketing expert, but he could have fooled me. He's a professor of business analytics and community management and principal of the Business Analytics Institute. Now, we've been discussing his career in business analytics and community management and how he approaches teaching data science to MBA and master's students. So, Lee, as an academic, and all transparency, I'm certainly not. And let's even absolve you and say we're not legal scholars, we're not privacy scholars, we're users, and in many ways, we're impacted by a lot of the legislation that's coming down the pike in Europe and in the US. US more on a state-by-state basis, which is ridiculous, but we'll leave that story for later. When you look at these pieces of regulation, just as somebody who gets impacted by this, as a common citizen, you get the sense that the regulators have understood the problems that they're trying to solve for? Or do you feel like we're, one of the ways that I liken regulators' efforts is how it's something that happened to me, and I'm sure it's happened to a lot of people when you first learn how to drive. I used to have an instructor back in India who used to be quite casual about telling me when to turn. And so he would go into the middle of the intersection and say, yeah, you can take a left here. And then I would have to find a way of taking a left. And one of those occasions, we went and go into an intersection and he says, yeah, you need to turn left here, because he seemed to have suddenly woken up. And what I do is, rather than pressing the brake and the clutch and changing the gear and then moving in that direction, I press the accelerator. So I've now made the turn really fast. I almost ran over a dog in the process. Thankfully, the dog escaped. It always strikes me whenever I think of regulators that sometimes in their effort to control something, they've actually ended up doing just the opposite, or rather by, for example, enacting some of these laws, they've made the very tech platforms they wanted to control a lot more powerful because they're the only ones who can get consent, so on and so forth. So just a general sense of, do you feel frustrated sometimes when you look at well-meaning pieces of legislation not doing what they're supposed to do?
Well, yes, but in asking the question, you're opening up a can of worms or Pandora's box with a lot of extremely challenging questions. The first question might be the role of the legislator. There are privacy laws, of course, here in Europe with GDPR. In California, in Switzerland, they have an excellent example. In India also, they've made a lot of progress. But the difficulty for legislation is that it's always it's a long process and based on what exists. And if you look at the legislation concerning GDPR, for example, it was based on client-server systems with centralized databases in which they're trying to legislate de facto controlling what people have done, where the intent was to try to influence how people will use data in the future. And so this problem of latency at two levels is a major challenge. Latency in that where the legislators are working on problems that are already often 1 or 2 generations old. The second is the latency in that the intent being to influence behavior, that often the legislative punishment, if at best, comes de facto once the infraction has been committed. Trying to understand how we can influence positive behavior, I think, is legitimate for a legislator. They are the ones that have the legitimacy to try to preserve public goods like privacy, water that we drink, the air that we breathe, public parks that we use. The difficulty comes, how can we best influence behavior? I think a little bit about Dr. Lessing's suggestion that code is law, that the very computer code that we use today, even in the video conferencing software that we're using for this interview, is conditioning our behavior. That perhaps the best solution is to think about how we can use the code to try to influence positively the way that we're using data, the way that we're applying the algorithms, the way that we're communicating results.
So it's almost like the product development, the product design, given that a lot of these products are driven by code, itself is governed by laws or becomes, or is almost the law by which these products are made. So then you really don't need to regulate how they're used because they're coming in baked in a way almost with some of the use cases, right?
Yes. A couple of things here. First, we should keep in mind that the laws are just reflections of asymmetries of power and information. So, of course, a law is never treats everyone equally.
Yep.
And so there is a need to try to think about the data practices that we're developing and that we're evangelizing. What I think is perhaps most important is to work on, from the moment we're developing the code, to think about the questions of bias and privacy and accountability as we're developing the model. But I would also argue that we need to have the conversation, because sometimes it's not a law or code of ethics that's the most important. It's actually the conversation with your stakeholders and with your development team that will condition future behavior.
It's almost like if I were to develop a data product today, as opposed to the way, let's say, I developed data products before, in the past, the logic used to be more is better. In other words, you wanted more data sources, you wanted more integrations, you wanted more places of activation. And it's almost like there was a secondary thought placed to the impact of all that data collection on the people whose data you've collected. It's almost like a given that that data belonged to you because you collected it. Whereas now, one of the things that I think we should focus on is less is more. Almost like the brief should be, what's the least amount of information you need to make the most number of decisions as accurately as possible? And I think in many cases, I know that many marketing cases where we've tried to push the accuracy of a decision from 85 to 95%, and in the process collected way more data than we need to. And I think there's a question to be asked, can we not live with 85%? Is it necessary for us to collect this information, which isn't really useful from a business sense, but we've just collected it because we can. There's no law preventing us, right? And therefore we have done it. And I think that there is that shift, and I'm hoping that the next generation of data scientists sort of keep that in mind when they design solutions, as opposed to the one which my generation did, which was the floodgates are open. Let's go collect whatever we can and build whatever we can because it's going to be great.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would feed back to you 3 points. The first point deals with the amount of data, that it's not just because we have the data that it actually serves a useful purpose, especially when we're working in machine learning, which we're trying to just find a better solution. Often the complexity of the data set is such that we're not getting the optimal solution, that we could reduce it to something that's much easier to work with and much more useful to get an answer that will allow us to at least move forward in addressing the problem. The second point, I think that the right quantity of data depends on the trust that we're able to build with our internal and external customers. The value of the data doesn't come from its quantity, but from the trust that our customers have in our data practices. Then finally, I do believe that there is a real opportunity in allowing people to reclaim the ownership of their data. There's no reason why data needs to be stored on public servers in the cloud. private servers and corporation. There are architectures and there are solutions today that allow us to, with personal servers, to allow users, consumers, to maintain property of their data and then to release access to that data selectively for the applications that they would like to use.
On that, one of the things that I found, especially with privacy regulation, is that there's regulation and then there are standards, right? And I often find that the accompanying standards are either quite vague or they're left open to interpretation. So for instance, if I were to provide mobile telephony services anywhere in the world, I have to make sure that I can connect to any other phone. It doesn't really matter what brand I use, what phone handset there is, but an iPhone needs to talk to a Samsung. Samsung needs to talk to an iPhone, and that's not really an option. There's a standard, everyone adheres to that standard. 4G is 4G, 3G is 3G, so on and so forth. But there doesn't seem to be that same equivalence, right? Like, I can interpret a privacy law and say, I'm not going to allow anyone else access to the data I store. Someone else can say, well, I read this privacy law to mean as long as I have consent, I can do anything with it. Have you seen any efforts to create any standards around data practices, or especially surrounding some of these privacy laws, or do you think that that's non-existent?
No, very much so. Once again, we need to keep in mind that it's quite a political argument, and therefore the multiplicity of standards reflects the power structure between the private and public sectors and between different countries. You have one concrete example is the Open Finance Initiative in Great Britain, which there is a serious discussion on how they can institute standards that will allow for the use of third-party applications in improving banking and finance, which requires, of course, consent from the consumers. So there are initiatives, in several different areas, keeping in mind that privacy laws in health and defense are quite differently applied than they would be to other industries. There is a need for discussion. Once again, I would like to insist on conversation. I think one of the weakest points of the argument today is that we don't really understand either the value of our data nor the risk of allowing other people to use our data. As you mentioned, I believe we are owners of our data unless we explicitly give ownership to a third party.
Dr. Lee, for someone who is not a quote-unquote expert on marketing and not a quote-unquote expert on law, I have to say some of these opinions make so much of sense. And thank you so much for the time that you spent with me. I have to say that, like I said, sometimes you have to go to people who truly understand what powers a lot of these decision-making and who are far removed from some of the applications to truly understand how we can make some of these worlds better. So I love some of these areas that we've gone in. I truly believe that what you've said, especially about ownership of data, shifting back into the hands of people who actually helped generate it in the first place, which is very different from any other product that's been created in industry. And then secondly, the idea that we've got to start having A, the conversation, but B, also start discussing what is the data, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for, and then work backwards to say what solution best solves for it, and recognizing that not everything is the same. They seem very simple, but the number of times I've seen both those principles get violated repeatedly, even by people who have sophisticated, deep understanding of some of these areas. I'd be a rich man if I were to count that. But thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for your time. And it was an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. I know that your interest and your passion is in marketing, but your experience and expertise in data science shows, after all, data is by definition, just a small part of reality. And that if we want to help our students and our customers better understand the power of data science, we need to focus on real world problems and then how people use data to try to address these problems for a better future. I really appreciate this conversation, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely, Dr. Lee. Thank you. And that'll do it for this episode of Fair Play. If you like the show, please take a moment to subscribe so you'll get notified when I release new episodes. Also, if you have a moment, I'd love it if you left us a review so that other folks like yourself can learn about the show. I'll see you next time.
This has been Fair Play with Arun Kumar. If you want to uncover the keys to using data wisely and fairly in an ever-changing world, go to arunckumar.com for more insights and resources. Fair Play is a production of Forbes Books.